This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 20. May has got the wrong plan for Brexit.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. Steve Keen is with me again. And today, another free episode of the podcast because we wanted you to hear this. We're looking at Brexit and how it's going to happen. Theresa May, of course, has given her 12-point plan for Britain's exit from Europe. But did it really tell us anything new? And if it did, is she giving us the right approach? More to the point, will her plan, or indeed the idea of leaving the EU at all, be to the benefit of the lower income earners in Britain? Because whatever you might think about the way the EU operates, is leaving it a little hasty? Well, the people of Britain have voted. Many want a hard Brexit because they like the idea of making a clean cut of it all. But let's remember, 44% of what we earn in overseas trade comes from Europe. We don't just want to chuck that away, do we? And look, there are few things that I disagree with Steve Keen on, but Britain getting out of Europe right now is one of them. I think we should have stayed and fought for change from the inside rather than, as I see it, cutting our hand to spite our face. But maybe we'll find some room for agreement, and maybe that'll be on what Theresa May had to say. Is she going about it the right way? I suspect not. But look, Steve, let's start with, why you think we should be out of Europe. Have I got this right? Because we have spoken about this in the past. Your argument is that the idea of free trade isn't necessarily a good one because it hinders diversity that's needed within an economy. So the free trade argument's not a good one. The inefficiencies and bureaucracies of the EU outweigh any benefits, and I think a lot of people would agree. I would agree with you on that as well. And then your other one is that the EU is going to collapse anyway, so Britain is giving itself a head start by being out of it. That's in a nutshell the reasons you'd give for voting for Brexit.
Pretty much, yeah.
But do you accept also that in the short term, it's also going to hurt Britain? That the person who's going to feel the hurt the most is going to be the lower income households who probably did vote to leave Europe, because there's going to be this whole transition period, and it's not going to be a comfortable one.
Yeah, that's quite feasible, and of course the way it's made how it's going to come through, of course, with the devaluation, then you're going to get an increase in expense of food imports and oil imports and things like that, which are going to hit the working class bottom line. Which
we're starting to see, and we haven't seen fully, of course, because deals are negotiated over a period, and we haven't really seen. We've seen the cost of living increase, but it's going to increase more, almost certainly.
Yeah, and then in some sense that this is true. I'm not going to say there's not going to be negatives out of all this stuff, but the working class have been screwed so successfully by the English system over the last 40 years in terms of cost of living increases, poll tax, all this sort of stuff. They've been copying it for ages anyway. And I think in many ways, I think the European Union has been used as a cover to avoid doing things domestically that they need to do. My favourite example there being the obsession about running a surplus. Now, as I try to get this through to people, that's not a good idea for governments to run a surplus. So the best way to explain it is say, well, you want to save money, don't you? How do you save money? And the answer is you can't collectively save money, the working class. Worker X can, the working class itself can't, because the only way you can save more money is to somehow create it, and you're not allowed to make it. It's called forgery. Whereas the government runs a deficit, it's effectively allowed to forge. It prints the pound notes, and that gives you increased money there. Now, that particular way of what ends up with austerity programs is you screw the working class, because it's all about cutting back on spending for the, you cut back on welfare, you cut back on pension services, you cut on all these things that don't actually affect the ruling class mob who are making the decisions.
Sure.
Except when Cameron, of course, found that he was complaining about library services being shut down. Did you see that?
Yeah, no.
He wrote a letter to his local council complaining about the cutback on services
exactly.
being caused by his own cutbacks. So you have this whole a cover in some ways that the European Union gave to all this sort of batten down on the working class type behaviour.
Right.
And that's my main factor, that yes, okay, the working class will suffer through an increase in cost of living and so on, but
And the someone is inflation. I mean, we're going to see inflation as well. I mean, we're
going to see inflation.
And who benefits the most from that inflation is going to be the people who've got the highest debt, people who've leveraged the most, because they're the people who, have got the assets to leverage against. And, we've talked about how, inflation is a good thing in that it devalues what you owe. So again, that inflation is going to be a good win for the wealthy, not such good news for the little people.
Yeah, I mean, it's all feasible. I mean, I'm not saying there are no negatives out of this. I think the negatives are massively exaggerated because if you look at what the Bank of England itself said, what the IMF said, what the OECD said, they're all about instant panic, total disaster. The day after Brexit, the wheels fall off the economy, and the wheels kept on going quite nicely because momentum is just as important in economics as it is in mechanics, and the momentum kept on turning forward. So I'm not saying there aren't going to be negatives, but I'm saying that there were plenty of negatives anyway being imposed as part of the overall political milieu that existed beforehand. They got wiped out.
For sure. And I'm with you on that. I'm just wondering whether, in fact, we're going to make this in the short term, and how long is that short term going to be? Because of those reasons we've just given, the cost of living is going to be more expensive. Some of the benefits are going to be the wealthiest. And we're also going to, we could find ourselves paying tariffs to trade with Europe, and that could amount to the billions. Maybe as much as £6 billion. So instead of the government paying net £8.5 billion to the EU, companies might be paying something, getting towards that. And in return, the UK is going to have no control over any regulations that the EU imposes. So there's going to be a cost of doing business with Europe, and it's, it is 44% of our export trade. I mean, that's, again, in the short term, that's going to hurt, isn't it?
Yeah, but at the same time, if there are tariffs imposed by the European Union on Britain, there'll be tariffs imposed by Britain on the European Union.
Right.
And when you look at the trade balance overall, there's Germany in particular, of course, but the European Union in general has a trade surplus with England. So the overall impact in that sense is going to be worse on European exports to England than it is going to be on English exports to Europe.
But you said that word overall, but you look at each individual country. We're, 44% of our trade is going to, is with Europe. If you look at, Germany, it's only a fraction of that. So we might be, I think we're the third most important nation in terms of exports for Germany. And for sure, they are selling more to us than, they're buying from us. But, we're still, 15% of their total level of exports from Germany. So, I mean, they'll feel there, but it's not the same as 44%, is it?
No, that's true. It's one of these things where the real focus I'm taking is that whenever these things are evaluated in standard analysis, what people focus upon is what's the impact upon the person as a consumer. As if that is your fundamental role in society, is to be a consumer. Now, you can only be a consumer if you've got an income. And my focus is on the opposite side and saying what's going to happen to the people as producers, as income generators. How is this going to affect you? And on the same basis that this was an argument in favour of free trade, it'll be cheaper for you as a consumer, assuming, and this is quite seriously what happened in all these bloody academic papers that justify free trade, assuming what once was said to me by Alan Powell. You might not remember his name, but he was the director of Australia's what they call Industry Assistance Commission, which the unions down there nicknamed the Industry Assassination Commission. And he gave a paper at a conference I organised back in the 1980s, I think they actually might have been the 1970s, I'm showing my age here, on trade with Southeast Asia. And the title of the conference is Trade to Whose Advantage? And he presented the results of a general equilibrium model of the economy, where there were going to be a 25% cut in tariffs. And these days, of course, tariffs are substantial. You're talking tariffs of 60 and 80% on textiles and things like that. A 25% cut in the tariffs for textiles and footwear and motor vehicles and one other industry classification. And he had a line in the paper saying, assuming good macroeconomic management. So you can guess who challenged him. What does that actually mean? Yeah. And the translation of good macroeconomic management was there'd be no net loss of jobs because of the tariff cut. Right. No, I'm sorry. That's what you can assume if you're writing an academic paper for a bunch of wankers in a conference seminar somewhere. But if you're actually going to impose that on the real world, you're assuming a 25% cut in your tariffs overnight, which is what, of course, the Australian government did do in the 1970s under Gough Whitlam, following the advice of these people. is going to have no impact on aggregate employment. If that's true, go for it, because you gain as a consumer, you don't lose the producer, whoopee-doo, everybody comes out better. That's why Trump won. Imposing nonsense policies like that is why Trump won. And from my perspective as being, you cannot ignore the role of people as producers when you make decisions about changing policies that are going to affect consumers as well. And so my feeling is, yes, okay, Brexit is going to damage the English working class as consumers, because they will face an increase in basic costs like oil and the massive food imports Britain has to. You don't grow strawberries in Britain. You certainly don't develop wine in Britain. You got to import those things. So yes, those costs are going to rise. But at the same time, you're going to also, out of a 25% devaluation, which just shows how overvalued the currency was beforehand, by the way.
If it sticks, of course. I mean, you know the way the markets operate. It could bounce back. You know, in 10 years, it might be back where it is now, and that competitive advantage of the devalued currency disappears.
But in the meantime, it might give a chance to fix up the damage that's occurred over the period when we have had the overvalued exchange rate, and when that's been pretty much the same time. And I think there's certainly a link. The same time we've been members of the European Union, because if you go back 25 years, roughly, manufacturing employment and manufacturing GDP in particular, in England was about 23% of the total GDP. Now it's about 11%. Now, over the same time period, Germany's gone from roughly 23% to roughly 23%.
Yeah.
So there's been a huge halving at the scale of manufacturing employment in this country. And therefore, people have got, they've got, normally, as we know now, if you're a working class, what they mean by a service job for you is working in Tesco's or working in a 0-hour contract somewhere. For the wealthy, a service job means selling debt to people from the city and making a fortune, but with a relatively secure job. So they've been done in as producers all the way through.
Yeah.
And my focus saying, okay, they might lose as consumers. It's got some chance of turning around what's happened to them as producers and as income earners.
But producing what is the question? Because if there's a tariff, I think what you're trying to say is if we've got tariffs with Europe, then some of the stuff that comes from Europe now might be made in the UK. But that wasn't at all mentioned, was it, in Theresa May's speech? Out of her 12 points, she didn't say anywhere, well, this is an opportunity for Britain to produce. It was all about being a global Britain. And there's nothing saying, well, now we can start creating stuff for a domestic market that we might have been importing from Europe because the tariff barriers are going to go up. And I think that's what you're saying. There's the opportunity. Yeah. Well, it wasn't in her speech at all.
Look, I'd be surprised if it was. We're dealing with a bunch of politicians who've grown up in the Blairite days and the belief in neoliberal economic and political policies. Of course, they don't even think about this.
Right. Because
why make a contrarian voice?
Right. And because they're not thinking about it, it means they're not doing anything about it. Because, of course, we've talked a lot about how Labour doesn't adapt immediately. So there's, first of all, it's got to be part of your policy. And secondly, it's going to take time. You can't suddenly create industries overnight.
In fact, I think it might be better if it's not part of their policy. Because I had read a little satirical piece for a new online journal called The Verdict a couple of days ago, and that was asking me to comment on the whole Brexit, etc., etc. And I started off with a quote from one of the few episodes of Harry Potter that I've seen, where Harry Potter and Hermione are about to magically appear somewhere else in the Rowling's universe, and Hermione says, "Look, we've got to have a plan." And Harry says, hang on, we make a plan, we get somewhere, all hell breaks loose. When have any of our plans ever actually worked?
Right, okay.
Now, that's a bit like economic policy. I mean, if they're doing it by accident, by causing a devaluation, it shows how little they think about manufacturing if you didn't say what's going to happen if the lower pound is sustained.
But what's going to change in reality? So if we have tariff barriers going up with the EU, first of all, 10% is not a whole heap, particularly when we've got a devalued currency. So will it be enough? I guess the devalued currency works the other way when we're starting to talk about imports. But is it still going to be enough for companies to say, oh, here's an opportunity to sell on the domestic market, and these companies spring up magically from nowhere? I mean, it could take decades, couldn't it, for that sort of thing to happen?
And this is what it's much easier to destroy an industry by cutting tariffs than it is to create industry by putting tariffs up.
Yeah,
and that's you're not old enough. You weren't long enough in Australia to know this one, but back in 1972, 73, the major manufacturer of televisions was called AWA. Australian Wireless Amalgamated.
Yeah, I remember that tower in the centre of town.
Well, the tower's still there. The company got destroyed when Gough Whitlam followed the advice of, not of Alan Powell, but one of his predecessors, the Industries Assassination Commission, that one way to reduce inflation was to cut tariffs by 25% overnight without warning, which was done. Bugger all impact on the inflation rate, because as you say, all these contracts they tend to be much more long term, and that was a chance for a bit of profit gouging by foreign producers selling into the country. But that was the end of AWO having any chance in the market, and it disappeared, and so did the manufacturing jobs that went with it, and so on. So it's this sort of thing where you destroy the industry very rapidly. To build it in the opposite direction, much harder. But one encouraging. I'm not going to say it's the peace in our times movement, but the trade deficit increased in the last couple of months for England, largely because of a substantial increase in capital goods imports. So it implies there is some people saying, well, with this price advantage, now if you think about somebody who's actually importing components or importing components from manufacturing process, if you're importing them from overseas and suddenly if it is a spot market and they pick to be 20-25% more expensive, that's at the level I think, well, it's actually probably cheaper to make it ourselves. So there is some momentum there. The industry hasn't been completely destroyed. I mean, you are talking 11% of GDP. I'm sure that's about twice the level that applies in Australia, for example. But there is a potential.
But using your argument back at you that it's a lot easier to destroy a market through tariffs than it is to drop the tariff and have them created. If you're running a car plant selling to the people of Europe and you build it in the UK, and then a tariff is introduced for importing into the Eurozone, I mean, you might stay in the UK because wages are low, but and that sort of compensates for the 10% tariff. But then if wages start to increase, if Britain doesn't accept the fact that perhaps it needs to be the Mexico of Europe, that car company surely at some point is going to say, well, there really is very little advantage here. Most of our market is inside the Eurozone. Let's move there.
Well, it's also a question of the link you want to have between highly skilled work and low skilled work in a manufacturing process. There's actually an excellent article, I think it's in the New York Review of Books, maybe New York Times, talking about people who voted for Trump and saying, why did they vote for them? Who are these working class people who have thrown their lot in with Trump rather than the Democrats? And a guy went inside an industry a factory making fuel injectors, and found that when you looked very, very carefully at the processes involved in manufacturing a fuel injection system for an automobile, the level of skill you needed to control the computer-driven device that did the incredibly fractions of a micron adjustments to the size of the nozzles and the timing rates being done in microsecond timing rates to make sure each fuel injecting unit was sound, required not quite a university level, but a high technical college level. You had to understand computer programming, the Linux operating system, a huge range of things to drive this machine properly. And you're looking at about 5 years of training. And you wanted to have somebody who had the academic background to do that, or intellectual background to do it. Then had put it inside a housing. Now, the housing itself is something which the job of putting the fuel injection unit inside the housing involves a machine which takes about a day to learn how to operate. And the thing is, do you do that domestically in America, or do you do it in Mexico? You'd pay 1/10 as much, well, not quite that bad, say 1/5 as much for the wages in Mexico as you pay in America. But the shipping costs involved in getting there, the turnaround time, etc., and the fact that if anything goes wrong, you've got to control a remote factory rather than a local worker. You can go and berate for making a mistake. That was so substantial that you need a huge gap in the price cost levels to make it worth your while to do it. And therefore, this factory had both the highly skilled worker making the fuel injection unit and the unskilled worker, but intensely competitive unskilled worker they were profiling, doing the housing machine. Now, it's a similar sort of calculation here. If you have a small change in the tariff, then it's just not going to have much of it. I think in the exchange rate and also any tariff rules, it's not going to have much of an impact. But if it gets to the stage where it's big enough to say, God, the cost advantage is still there for producing the stuff offshore, but it's so it's so small now compared to all the difficulties that throws in our way, the logistics of shipping parts for manufacturing overseas and bringing them back in, quality control and so on. That's enough. That can be enough. So it's got to be a substantial.
Well, it introduces a new element of risk, doesn't it? On your business plan, there's a fluctuation there in exchange rates that you didn't have before.
Which, if you had like domestic manufacturing, you wouldn't have that fluctuation. So that is one reason that the substantial devaluation England has achieved. I wouldn't say it's suffered. It's achieved out of voting to leave the euro, the European Union. That's given it probably enough to make it attractive to bring some of this manufacturing back on shore.
Right. But that gets back to my point, though, because it is suffering in the short term, isn't it? Particularly for low income. But let's look. At the same time, Let's look at another aspect of this. I mean, out of all of this, it's interesting, isn't it? That again, there was nothing mentioned at all about how, we talk about how we're going to be a new global Britain. So, new trade is going to come our way. So we're going to somehow, replace this 44% of trade that we're doing with Europe with new trade agreements elsewhere. But there's, been no talk from the government about how those trades are going to develop. There was no talk about education or, for example, for the people of Sunderland who might lose, at some point might lose a car plant, importing in those alternate industries which will, will spring up because of the opportunity, because of the exchange rate and, maybe the fact that we can produce stuff domestically now that we're importing from Europe. No talk at all from the government, was there, about how this is going to happen? It's just magically going to be created.
Yeah, well, then again, that's also focusing on trade rather than focusing on local industry development.
Yeah.
As I've said, when you look empirically at what actually causes economies to grow faster, it's never been trade in the first instance. It's
always been domestic.
Domestic development. And that's like where the atlas of economic complexity that Harvard University runs with data scientists rather than economists behind it. Danny Roddick's work on the same front, looking historically at successful cases of industrialization and growth like Japan and South Korea over time. It's always been a focus on industrial development. And because we have neoliberal policies like May, politicians like May still making up the decisions and doing the thinking about this, they're still thinking inside the framework, well, trade and specialization, that's what matters. They're wrong. Yeah. So in that sense, I was pleased to see at least bursting their bloody policy bubble, because unless we burst the bubble substantially, we're going to continue with these policies focusing on things that don't work.
Well, so she is doing that, isn't she? So she's saying, well, if we don't get a free trade agreement with Europe, then we're going to get free trade agreements with everyone else, countries like the US. Well, guess what? I mean, we already export 15% of our goods to the US as it stands. Are we really going to get much more just because Donald Trump says his mum likes it here? We might get a few extra hotel nights out of that one, but are we going to see a substantial increase? And why? And we're getting that without a free trade agreement. And look, you and I have seen the perils of free trade agreements with the US, because the Trans-Pacific Partnership, meant for Australia, for example, the danger was lower cost unbranded medicine would disappear. Governments were going to be forced to inflict heavier controls on copyright infringement. There are impacts on the legal system. In fact, the sorts of influence we have from the EU. In fact, I mean, you enter into a free trade agreement with the US, you're almost certainly going to see, very similar. It's free trade means the opposite, doesn't it? Generally, free trade means, what restrictions are we going to impose on you?
Well, particularly with America, I mean, this is one of the insane things about focusing on free trade agreements, is the be all and end all. Because you're right, the Americans use these things to get their dominance of basically copyright. And I mean, my favourite there, I don't know how many people know this, the length of time after the author's death that copyright is maintained on some literary work, I think is now at the order of 70 years. And why is it 70 years? It's because it's about 70 years since Walt Disney died. And every year that they used to be 25 years. I think it used to be 20. The age of the author was 25. Yeah. Then it got to be so. Mickey Mouse was about to go out of copyright, so bang, it became 20 plus 40. Then became plus 50, and then plus 60, plus 70. And the Americans, of course, because they own this copyright, they're quite happy to go and bat, so that when you sign up that so-called free trade agreement, what it does, it locks you to American copyright terms, and you've got to continue giving copyright to these things 50 and 70 years after the author died. There's no bloody reason why Mickey Mouse should be earning a revenue for for Walt Disney's whoever owns what Walt Disney's capital went to. That's the insane element of these things, and the naivety of governments, particularly like Malcolm Turnbull on that front, saying what a great deal TPP would be for Australia and why how terrible was Bill Shorten said he'd oppose it. It's a disaster. So in that sense, all this obsession with free trade agreements and free trade regions and so on, first of all, is based on a false vision of specialisation as the ideal target for industrial growth, when in fact it's diversification that empirically succeeds. And secondly, I think it's because politicians get a chance to go and sign something and be seen to do something. And that's what they want to do. It's the vision of them doing something, and it's all tied up with a status thing that the politicians have gained out of the whole neoliberal period. And frankly, again, back to the mistakes, I'd rather see them get out of the way in that sense. And rather, we need a Lee Kuan Yew here, not a May.
Yeah. So isn't there a danger that, we are going to, whatever the benefits might be of pulling out of the EU, that we're going to stuff it up by taking exactly the wrong policy direction and missing the opportunity?
Well, that's why I'm glad to see that the pound has fallen so much. That sort of is ending a speculative bubble that kept the pound too high to begin with. And it's equally possible that the tariffs will have a similar sort of impact, because that, in effect, a tariff increase is like a further devaluation in terms of the cost advantages for local industry. So I think, again, by accident rather than by design.
Right, but again, in the short term, people feel hurt from that. I can see where you say it's an opportunity for domestic business to grow, but and also for international trade. Once perhaps new industries will emerge, but they could take a generation, couldn't they? And then in the meantime, we've got the working class potentially losing jobs. If they're not losing jobs, they're not seeing an increase in their salaries, but they are seeing an increase in the cost of living. They are going to be substantially worse off, aren't they?
But at the same time, the whole pressure on reducing wages. And that's talk about that we don't have class conflict anymore. Yes, we do. It's the bosses win it rather than the workers. That's been the driving down in wages in England over time. The pressure to reduce wages, apparently, and in terms of, I can't swear by this, but I've seen some data and graphs alleging that the fall in wages since the 2008 crisis in England has only been equalled by the fall in wages in Greece. So in that sense, one thing which has also come out of this leaving the European Union is again the pressure on trying to reduce wage rises. That disappeared. And the politicians have been supporting that pressure to reduce wages and the belief that makes England more competitive. There are better ways to be competitive than driving your wage costs down.
Right, but that's what's going to happen, isn't it? So, another point from Theresa May was, threatening that if we don't get a free trade agreement with the EU, and of course that's what she was asking for. She was saying, well, we don't want to be part of the EU, but we do want to have a free trade agreement. So we don't want to pay any of the costs for being part of the EU, but we want to have a free trade agreement, and we don't want it, presumably in that free trade agreement, she's going to want none of the regulations that come with being in the EU, which, good luck with that one. We know that's not going to happen. So then we go to her threat, which is that if we don't get that, then the UK is going to become a low tax, low regulation economy. Now that sounds, great for the multinationals. It's going to do nothing at all for wages apart from pushing them down even further. So what she's saying is, bad news for the workers.
Yeah. It's the mess we've made by following these neoliberal policies rather than the mercantilist stuff that you had happening in China and Japan and most of Southeast Asia is coming home to roost in terms of income distribution and wages for workers in this country. So,
You're speechless. You're speechless. I want this moment to be recorded. Steve Keen gets speechless on this one. Yeah. So
relatively, yeah.
What about? The reason, of course, people think that they are being hard done by and their wages aren't increasing is because of immigration, which, of course, is the big issue behind all of this. People want to control who comes here and why. That famous John Howard line, the Australian Prime Minister, who said, "We will decide who comes to this country and in which circumstances they come." But the UK obviously doesn't want to cut immigration off totally because otherwise businesses would close and taxes would disappear unless we believe what Katie Hopkins claimed this week, that there are millions of migrants under the radar here who don't pay taxes. But we're still going to need people, particularly if we've got growing businesses. So really control of immigration, but, is it really going to have too much of an impact unless, Katie Hopkins is right and there's lots of people who aren't paying tax? Otherwise, what impact is a control of immigration really going to have?
Well, I mean, the real reason that makes it an issue, I can go back to quoting Wynne Godley from 1992, and you couldn't get a more racially reasonable person than Wynne. He was absolutely no racial attitude or anti-migrant attitude whatsoever in his logic. He wrote that given the design of the European Union, when a crisis occurred, then that would force governments to cut back on spending when the economy itself was reducing spending. And therefore, the only way out would be emigration as an alternative to poverty or starvation, quote unquote. Now, he's dead right. We have a systemic failure with the European Union through the euro. There is, in that basis, there's immigration occurring not because people prefer to move from one country to another, like I call episodic immigration. Immigration because they have no choice. It's either that or starvation, and that's systemic immigration.
Right, but but if UK wages are not going anywhere, why would they come here? Why wouldn't they go to Germany?
They do go to Germany as well. So Germany is copying this at the same time. So you get quite strong pressure in Germany right now, anti-migrant, out of the same phenomenon. But certainly English wages haven't fallen as badly as Spanish wages, for example. And if you're not caught up in the low income end of the spectrum, then certainly there are better pay prospects here than there are in most of the European Union and in the countries bordering it that are mistakenly trying to join it. So those sorts of pressures mean that you have systemic levels of immigration when it was only ever designed for episodic levels of immigration. And that has been, and at the same time, of course, with austerity being imposed by the Conservatives here, you had a cutback in services in the regions where a lot of these migrants were turning up, and that's where a lot of the tension came from. And historically, too, the only time that immigration has not caused political conflict is when there's been full employment. Now, we've let that go by the wayside, and we're wondering why the working class is complaining. One of my favourite papers ever is by a historical paper back in the 1970s by a Macquarie University economist called Marie de Leprevanche, and she wrote a piece about the profile of the political conflict in Australia over about 150 years of emigration, and she said the political opposition to the next wave of emigration came from the previous wave, because they were the ones who were threatened by losing their jobs.
But we have right. But we've got an opportunity, haven't we, to develop new industries. That's what you're saying. The big opportunity is brought on by the exchange rate. The fact that the pound is worth a lot less. So that has two benefits. One is that it makes imports more expensive, so it gives a leg up for domestic industries. And secondly, if those domestic industries then export, then it's cheaper to export. So for that growth, you're going to need labour, and you're going to need, some of those industries are going to need low cost labour, and some of that low cost labour is not going to exist in the UK. So we are going to need, and it's going to need expertise as well, which we might not have. So we're going to need an immigration policy. I guess the difference is that we have a bit more control over what sorts of people are coming in.
Yeah, and you also would have, there are a lot of people who are working in welfare jobs and are living on welfare, working in zero-hour contract jobs here and so on, who would do a lot better if they got rather more reliable employment in a factory situation as unskilled labour, which they used to have. There's the other thing we have to talk about at some stage as well is the trend for employment overall as technology continues pushing towards the point where we will need very little labour, certainly very little unskilled labour to manufacture, and then that's got huge income distribution elements as well.
But I agree with you on that. But all of these things are perhaps 10, 20, 30 years down the line, and yet Britain leaving the EU is happening immediately. And what I'm again getting back to is, who's taking the short-term hit? And
my feeling is, yes, you might take a short-term hit. Like, it's really, really terrifying to jump out of an aeroplane when it seems to be flying well. But if it crashes 20 minutes after you jump out, you sort of think, oh, gee, it was worth that.
Unless you haven't got a parachute on.
You've got to have we have a parachute, and all the images you see, all these bloody cartoons of cats jumping off roofs and missing the next one and falling into a tank down below is the image of what's actually happened with Brexit. It may be that Britain has started the process of leaving a sinking ship before the ship actually starts to sink.
Right.
And that's ultimately, that's my reason for saying it. It certainly has short-term pain. There are big question marks about whether the benefits will be sufficient to make up for it, but I think the whole damn thing's going to collapse anyway. And because Britain has actually started doing it beforehand, it's going to find, oh, gee, we actually got prepared for this. What a shock.
Right. But before it collapses, I mean, who's to know? I mean, even Le Pen is saying that she wants to remain within Europe. She just wants to be out of the euro. But
that's huge. So when they're out of the euro, then everything else changes as well. So,
yeah. But it's looking less and less likely, though. I mean, we've been surprised, of course, numerous times. So it's looking less and less likely that Le Pen's going to win, but you never know. But, so there could be a change in the shape of politics in Europe. Absolutely. This year. We also have the big problem with regional differences within the UK. And I don't know how this is going to wash. So Scotland wants out. There's no solution. And again, Theresa May was saying, we'll find a solution to that land border in Ireland. I don't know how she's going to do it without policing it, and dividing the island of Ireland. She talks of a plan to strengthen the union between the four nations of the UK. I mean, she's got to be kidding on this, hasn't she? There is no answer. We are going to have a land border with the European community. And if you want to control the immigration, if you don't want free movement of people, you've got to have someone there checking passports on the way in. That means dividing the island of Ireland. There's no other way.
Yeah, I know. That's again, there's nothing. I mean, one of my favourite lines in a pretty bad movie, the old movie Cocktail, was just after, what's his name, the American actor who belongs to Scientology. Had broken up with his girlfriend, and she came out, he behaved appallingly inside an art gallery, and she came out and she said, look, it shouldn't end this badly. And he says, things always end badly. That's why they end. And in that sense, I think, yes, it's going to be messy, for sure. Yeah. And yes, you're right, that's a border issue, and the last thing that part of Ireland needs is more tension. Right,
absolutely. So that's going to be bad. And there's going to be a lot of people hurting. And I'd get to my, the final question, a yes or no one for you on this. Because I agree with, almost everything you're saying. I agree with the ideology. And my concern is that we're fighting an ideology against a short-term reality. And the short-term reality could be that the common man in the UK, those who've listened to Nigel Farage about taking back control, they're the ones who could be worse off, and they could possibly be worse off for the rest of their lives.
I don't think for the rest of their lives out of this one decision. But what I do think, we are fighting an ideology, and the ideology I'm fighting is neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And in that case, this is a defeat for neoliberalism, and it's about time it got them. So, and it's happening all over the globe, as we know as well. So that's why I still think neoliberalism is based on an idea that we know how to manage the economy. Well, look where that got us. And this is a defeat for that ideology, and that's at least a start in the right direction.
Right. And everything Theresa May said yesterday, any value in any of it? It seems to be that she's saying, what we had is a problem, and we are going to just continue with that problem by having the problem with someone else rather than having it with Europe.
Yeah, there's no particular insight there. But then again, there's policy by accident works better than policy by design when your designers are neoliberals.
All right. So in other words, let's hope she doesn't do too much.
Exactly.
All right. Same for a lot of politicians, I think. All right. Good to talk, Steve. We'll talk again soon.
Okay, mate.
Yeah, to me, all I heard from Theresa May was this veiled threat that if Britain doesn't get what it wants, it's going to go somewhere else, somewhere that's not just a narrow strip of water away. And for all that talk of a global Britain, well, how's that going to happen? What are we going to sell? And what's the government going to do to help those new businesses to develop? In short, I think it was all talk and very little substance from Theresa May. But are we surprised? Back in a few days with another podcast, another Debunking Economics podcast with me and Steve Keen. You can subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.